4:45 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 80 miles south of the Iranian coastline. The USS Gerald R. was not maintaining its usual silent patrol profile. Within the nerve center of the world's largest warship, the atmosphere had shifted from the rhythmic boredom of a long deployment to the sharp, electric edge of imminent violence. The carrier, a city of steel weighing over 100,000 tons, cut through the black water at 22 knots. The air on the flight deck was heavy with the scent of salt spray and the lingering chemical tang of burned jet fuel. Somewhere in the deep basements of the Pentagon, a decision had been made, and that decision was now vibrating through the hull of every ship in Carrier Strike Group 12. Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne stood in the Flag Command Center, his eyes fixed on the primary Blue Force tracker. For the last 72 hours, the United States Navy had been tracking a massive movement of Iranian mobile missile launchers. The intelligence was verified and absolute. This was not a drill, and it was no longer a diplomatic standoff. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had fueled their medium-range ballistic missiles, and the targeting data was already being uploaded to their guidance computers. The question was no longer if they would fire, but how many minutes remained before the first launch. The Admiral looked at his watch. It was exactly 4:48 in the morning on the 26th of March, 2026. Beside him, the strike group's operations officer spoke into a secure headset, his voice a low, steady drone that masked the gravity of the commands he was relaying. The carrier was the heart of the group, but the teeth were currently located 3 miles to the east and 4 miles to the west. There, the destroyer DDG-87 USS Mason and the cruiser CG-73 USS Port Royal were already rotating their Mark 41 vertical launch systems into an active status. Inside the hulls of the escort ships, the silence was heavy. In the combat information centers, the only light came from the soft glow of the ANSPY-6 radar consoles. Technicians sat with their hands hovering over keys, their faces illuminated in shades of blue and green. They were waiting for a single digital handshake from the carrier, a final authorization code that would release the most sophisticated cruise missiles in the American inventory. The mission was clear: neutralize every known ballistic missile site along the Iranian coast before a single enemy rocket could leave its rail. Outside on the dark waters of the Gulf, the sea was running with 1-meter swells. The water slapped against the steel sides of the ships with a hollow, metallic sound. To a casual observer, the fleet looked like a collection of ghosts, running without navigation lights and emitting no radio signals. But beneath the surface and within the electronic spectrum, the strike group was screaming with activity. Data links from orbiting satellites were pouring terabytes of information into the Tomahawk weapon control systems. The coordinates were precise: 27 degrees, 12 minutes north, 56 degrees, 17 minutes east. The targets were hardened bunkers, mobile TEL vehicles, and command and control nodes, buried deep within the coastal mountains. The commanding officer of the USS Mason felt the vibration of the ship's 4 gas turbine engines through the soles of his boots. He knew that in less than 10 minutes, his ship would become a pillar of fire. The crew had practiced this 1,000 times in simulators, but the air felt different today. It was thicker, charged with the weight of history. This was the first time a carrier strike group had been authorized to conduct a preemptive strike of this magnitude since the turn of the century. On the flight deck of the Gerald R. the final FA-18 Gulf Growlers were being chained down. Their role in the coming hour would be critical: to blind the enemy's radar and ensure the Tomahawks reached their marks. The pilots sat in their cockpits, oxygen masks on, watching the horizon. The sky to the east was beginning to turn a bruised purple, a hint of the dawn that many on the Iranian coast would never see. At 4:55, the flash priority signal arrived from Pacific Command. The message was 3 words: execute lighting rod. Admiral Thorne did not hesitate. He looked at the operations officer and nodded once. The command was typed, encrypted, and sent. Across the strike group, the status boards turned from yellow to a solid, pulsing red. The countdown had ended. The United States Navy was no longer observing. It was engaging. The data that triggered the strike did not arrive by accident or through a single source of intelligence. High above the Earth, a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite, designated Crystal, had been locked into a polar orbit that brought it over the Iranian coastline every 90 minutes. At exactly 3:45 in the morning on the 26th of March, 2026, the digital infrared sensors on the satellite detected a massive thermal bloom at the Imam Ali missile base near Bandar Abbas. This was not the heat of a standard vehicle engine. It was the distinct, shimmering thermal signature of supercooled liquid oxygen being pumped into the fuel tanks of a dozen Shahab-3 medium-range ballistic missiles. This was the definitive indicator that the United States military had been monitoring for weeks. The imagery was transmitted at the speed of light to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in Springfield, Virginia, and then immediately relayed to the windowless, high-security rooms of United States Central Command in Tampa, Florida. Within seconds, the information was flashed across the globe to the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. The intelligence was absolute. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had moved from a posture of strategic deterrence to active launch preparation. In the secure briefing room at Central Command, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the quiet hum of high-end servers. General Christopher Miller, the commander of Central Command, watched the live feed on a wall-sized liquid crystal display. The resolution was high enough to see the individual fueling hoses connected to the transporter erector launchers, or TELs. He knew that once the fueling process was complete, the missiles could be launched in under 15 minutes. Each of those missiles carried a 1,000-kilogram high-explosive warhead, capable of reaching any United States base in the region or striking the capital cities of regional allies. The decision-making process was a masterpiece of modern military systematic efficiency. This was the kill chain, in its most compressed form. Every second spent in deliberation was a second closer to a catastrophic Iranian launch. At 4:05 in the morning, General Miller initiated a flash priority conference call with the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States. The evidence was presented in less than 90 seconds. The satellite imagery showed 24 mobile launchers being moved out of their hardened tunnels and into pre-surveyed launch positions. The tactical assessment was clear. The only way to prevent a regional war was a decisive, preemptive neutralization of the threat. The President's authorization was verbal and immediate, followed by the transmission of the Gold Code authentication to the National Military Command Center. From there, the orders were routed through the global command and control system, bypassing standard relays to hit the Gerald R. Ford strike group directly. The strategic objective was simple: total destruction of the ballistic missile infrastructure within a 50-mile radius of the coast. This was not an attempt at a proportional response. It was a surgical removal of the enemy's ability to project power. In the Flag Command Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the intelligence trigger was translated into raw tactical data. The strike group's computers began the process of deconflicting the targets. Each Tomahawk cruise missile needed a specific, unique flight path to ensure they did not collide in midair, and to maximize the probability of bypassing Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries. The analysts on the carrier worked with a cold, professional focus. They assigned 40 missiles to the primary launch sites at Bandar Abbas, another 30 to the command bunkers at Bushehr, and 20 to the mobile radar arrays that provided the eyes for the PROS, Iranian Missile Force. The environment inside the command center was a stark contrast to the violence about to be unleashed. There was no shouting, no cinematic tension, only the rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the low, steady voices of officers confirming target coordinates. The latitude and longitude for every strike point were double-checked against the latest satellite updates. One target, a hardened command bunker, was located at coordinates 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 56 degrees 17 minutes east. It was buried under 30 meters of reinforced concrete. For this target, 2 Block 5 Tomahawk missiles were programmed to hit the exact same spot, 3 seconds apart. The first would blow away the earth and the outer concrete shell, and the second would drive deep into the heart of the bunker. By 4:30 in the morning, the intelligence cycle was complete. The target packages had been built, verified, and uploaded into the mission computers of the destroyers and cruisers surrounding the carrier. The intelligence trigger had been pulled, and the SPR hammer was now falling. The United States military had identified the threat, analyzed the window of opportunity, and prepared the response with a level of technical precision that no other force on Earth could match. All that remained was the final weapons-free command. 4:52 in the morning. 3 miles to the east of the carrier, the destroyer DDG-87 USS Mason began its final transformation into a launch platform. The ship was a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn horizon, its hull cutting through the 1-meter swells of the Persian Gulf, with a rhythmic, metallic hiss. On the foredeck and the aft deck, the armored steel hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch system began to cycle. There was no loud grinding, only the high-pitched whine of heavy hydraulics and the sudden, hollow clatter of steel sliding against steel. 64 individual cells on the USS Mason were now exposed to the night air. The cold Gulf breeze, thick with the iron smell of the sea, and the faint scent of hydraulic fluid, rushed into the gaps where the armored covers had been just seconds before. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was one of clinical, absolute focus. The tactical action officer, a lieutenant commander with 15 years of service, sat behind a semicircle of glowing displays. His headset was pressed tight against his ears, filtering the direct feed from the Flag Command Center on the USS Gerald R. Ford. To his left, the fire controlmen were executing the final digital handshakes. Each Tomahawk land attack missile, or TLAM, was a sophisticated robot in its own right, and each one required a verified mission up status. Before the thermal batteries could be activated, the computer screens displayed a forest of green icons, each one representing a missile nestled in its vertical canister. The targeting data, refined by the intelligence trigger described minutes earlier, was now being etched into the volatile memory of the missile's guidance computers. The coordinates were checked and rechecked. Latitude 27 degrees 12 minutes north, longitude 56 degrees 17 minutes east. The path for each missile was a complex three-dimensional corridor designed to thread the needle between Iranian radar coverage zones and the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains. All cells reporting green, the fire controlman announced, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. Mission data loaded. Guidance is internal. Thermal batteries are at nominal voltage. The lieutenant commander looked at the master engagement screen. On the other side of the carrier, the cruiser CG-73 USS Port Royal was reporting the same status. Between the two escort ships, 120 Tomahawk cruise missiles were primed. This was the largest single-salvo cruise missile strike in the history of the United States Navy. A concentrated hammer blow intended to erase an entire category of enemy threat in a single minute of violence. At 4:56 in the morning, the final authorization code arrived. It was a 24-character alphanumeric string that validated the presidential launch order. The tactical action officer entered the code into the strike console. The system paused for a fraction of a second, a final safety check of the ship's own logic gates. And then the status bar at the top of every screen in the room turned a solid, vibrant crimson. The words "Weapons Free" appeared in the center of the Admiral's display on the carrier and simultaneously on every firing console in the strike group. Weapons Free. Execute Strike Package Delta. The order came over the net. The tactical action officer on the USS Mason did not hesitate. He lifted a plastic guard over a physical button on his console and pressed it firmly. Birds away. Out of the north, out of the south. Deep within the first canister on the foredeck, a solid fuel rocket booster ignited with a sound that could be felt more than heard. It was a low-frequency rumble that shook the entire 8,900-ton frame of the destroyer. A split second later, the first Tomahawk punched through the thin sacrificial seal of its cell. A pillar of white-hot flame, 20 meters high, erupted from the deck of the ship, illuminating the entire superstructure in a blinding, flickering orange light. The missile cleared the deck in less than a second, its folding wings snapping. into place as it climbed into the dark sky. The roar was deafening, a physical weight that pushed against the eardrums of the sailors topside. This was only the beginning. Every 3 seconds, another cell on the USS Mason and the USS Port Royal would ignite. The night was about to be torn apart by the sound of 120 engines screaming toward the Iranian coast. At 4:57 in the morning, the horizon of the central Persian Gulf vanished behind a curtain of white smoke and jagged orange flame. The launch of 120 Tomahawk cruise missiles was not a singular event, but a rhythmic, mechanical process of destruction. On the deck of the destroyer DDG-87 USS Mason, the ripple fire sequence was in full effect. Every 3 seconds, a new cell in the Mark 41 vertical launch system ignited. The sound was a sequence of percussive thumps that vibrated through the steel soles of the ship, followed immediately by the soul-shaking roar of the solid rocket boosters. The missiles did not simply fly, they punched through the air, leaving behind a thick, roiling fog of white chemical smoke that blotted out the stars and coated the forward superstructure in a fine layer of gray soot. Across the dark water, the cruiser CG-73 USS Port Royal was mirroring the action. From a distance, the two escort ships looked like erupting volcanoes. The heat generated by the rapid-fire launch was immense, raising the temperature on the surrounding deck plates to over 500 degrees in a matter of seconds. The air around the ships was no longer the cool, salt-heavy breeze of the Gulf. It was a searing, oxygen-depleted vacuum filled with the acrid, metallic stink of burning propellant. Each missile, weighing 1,500 kilograms, cleared the deck in a blur of motion, climbing nearly 300 meters into the air, before its solid fuel booster was jettisoned and the small, efficient turbofan engine took over. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the radar screens were a chaotic swarm of blue icons. Each icon represented a Tomahawk moving at 880 kilometers per hour. The salvo integrity was maintained by the strike group's master computer, ensuring that the missiles did not fly in a straight line toward their targets. Instead, they fanned out in a massive, coordinated formation. Some turned north, others arched toward the east, following pre-programmed waypoints that would allow them to converge on the Iranian coastline from multiple directions simultaneously. The missiles were now in their cruise phase, dropping to an altitude of only 30 meters above the whitecaps of the Gulf. At this height, they were effectively invisible to long-range Iranian search radars, masked by the curvature of the Earth and the electronic clutter of the waves. This was the low and fast approach, a signature of United States naval doctrine. The missiles were no longer reliant on the ships for guidance. They were now independent hunters, using a combination of inertial navigation and the global positioning system to maintain a course toward coordinates 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 56 degrees 17 minutes east. High above the salvo, 4 EA-18 Gulf Growler electronic warfare aircraft from the carrier's air wing were already in position. They moved in a wide orbit 20 miles off the coast, their high-powered jamming pods beginning to flood the Iranian air defense frequencies with digital noise. They were the invisible shield for the Tomahawk wave. In short, the pilots of the Growlers watched their displays as the first wave of Tomahawks crossed the fence, the invisible line marking the edge of Iranian territorial waters. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the commanding officer watched the last of his assigned missiles disappear into the darkness. The silence that followed the final launch was deafening. The deck was littered with the scorched remains of the sacrificial seals from the launch cells, and the smell of cordite was so thick it stung the eyes of the lookouts. The ship felt lighter, having just expended millions of dollars of ordnance in less than 3 minutes. But the work was only half finished. The missiles were now 6 minutes from impact, and the strike group was transitioning into a defensive posture, prepared for the inevitable Iranian attempt at a counterstrike. The admiral on the Gerald R. Ford received the salvo complete report at exactly 5:02 in the morning. 120 missiles were in the air, all reporting mission green. There had been no launch failures and no malfunctions. The United States Navy had just projected more precision-guided firepower in a single minute than most nations could muster in a year. The long reach of the Fifth Fleet was now seconds away from the throat of the Iranian ballistic missile infrastructure. 5:03 in the morning. The Iranian coastline near the port of Bandar Abbas. The first wave of 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles crossed the surf line at a speed of 880 kilometers per hour. To any sentry standing on the dark coastal cliffs, the missiles would have been nearly impossible to see. They moved as small, gray shapes, flying only 30 meters above the whitecaps, their small turbofan engines producing a low-frequency hiss that was swallowed by the sound of the crashing waves. The air along the coast was cool and tasted of salt and dry earth, but as the missiles passed, they left behind a faint chemical trail of burnt high-grade kerosene. This was the most dangerous phase of the flight profile. The missiles were now over enemy territory, entering a landscape defined by jagged limestone ridges and deep, shadowed valleys. To survive, the Tomahawks engaged their terrain contour matching system. This onboard computer compared the physical shape of the ground below with a high-resolution digital map stored in its memory. The missiles did not fly a straight line. They surged upward to clear the coastal ridges and then dove back down into the valleys, hugging the earth to stay beneath the radar beams of the Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. The mission controllers watched the digital breadcrumbs on their screens. Each blue icon was now navigating through the Iranian interior, with a level of autonomy that was both terrifying and precise. The missiles were heading toward their primary objective, the Imam Ali ballistic missile base. The coordinates were locked at exactly 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 56 degrees 17 minutes east. At this specific location, 24 Iranian mobile launchers were being prepared for a strike against United States interests. The technical precision of the United States Navy's hardware was on full display. As the missiles approached their mid-course waypoints, they activated the digital scene-matching area correlation system. A small camera in the nose of each Tomahawk took a high-speed digital photograph of the ground and compared it to a target image. This allowed the missiles to correct their course within a margin of less than 3 meters, regardless of any jamming or interference with the global positioning system. The weapons were no longer just projectiles, they were intelligent, flying computers designed to find a specific door or a specific vent on a hardened bunker hundreds of kilometers away. High above the missiles, the 4 EA-18 Gulf Growler electronic warfare aircraft continued their work. The air over the province of Hormuzgan was thick, with invisible energy as the Growlers flooded the Iranian military's communication bands. The Iranian radar operators at the coastal air defense nodes saw only snow and shifting geometric patterns on their screens. They knew something was coming, but the electronic fog created by the United States Navy made it impossible to determine the number, speed, or direction of the incoming strike. The silence of the Iranian air defense response was a testament to the effectiveness of the American suppression of enemy air defenses. The environment of the Iranian interior was a stark contrast to the open water of the Gulf. The missiles streaked over ancient salt flats and past isolated mountain villages where the only sound was the wind. The smell of the desert, dry, dusty, and scented with wild sage, was momentarily displaced by the hot, oily exhaust of the cruise missiles. The Tomahawks moved in 3 distinct groups, timed to arrive at their targets at the exact same second, from the north, the south, and the west. This simultaneous time on target was designed to overwhelm any local point defense systems, such as anti-aircraft guns or short-range missiles, that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps might have stationed around the launch sites. By 5:07 in the morning, the first wave was less than 60 seconds from the primary target. The missiles began their terminal maneuvers, climbing to 500 meters before pitching their noses down into a high-angle dive. This maneuver was designed to maximize the kinetic energy of the impact and to ensure the 1,000-pound warheads hit the top of the mobile launchers where the armor was thinnest. On the carrier, Admiral Thorne and his staff stood in silence, watching the mission clock count down the final seconds. The intelligence trigger had been pulled, the weapons had been freed, And now, the physical collision of two regional powers was about to begin in the hills above Bandar Abbas. 5:08 in the morning. The Imam Ali Missile Base, nestled in the jagged, arid hills 5 miles north of the Bandar Abbas naval docks. The environment was a scene of frantic, mechanical activity. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, hundreds of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps technicians worked. In the cool morning air, which smelled of high-octane fuel and the dusty, metallic scent of the surrounding limestone, 24 transporter erector launchers, or TELs, were deployed in a wide arc across the valley floor. The massive Shahab-3 missiles, each 12 meters tall, were being raised into their vertical firing positions. The hydraulic hum of the launchers was the only sound in the valley, a low-frequency vibration that signaled the impending start of a regional conflict. The Iranian crews had no warning. The electronic warfare from the carriers at EA-18 Gulf Growlers had successfully blinded the local early warning radar arrays, leaving the valley in a state of false security. The first Tomahawk cruise missile appeared over the southern ridge, a gray blur moving at 880 kilometers per hour. It did not circle or hesitate. Following its pre-programmed terminal maneuver, the missile pitched its nose down into a 70-degree dive, directly toward the center of the launcher formation. The 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead punched straight through the reinforced steel cab of the lead mobile launcher, detonating with a force that bleached the valley white for a fraction of a second. The blast wave, traveling at thousands of meters per second, compressed the air with a bone-cracking thump that shattered every window within a 2-mile radius. The launcher did not just explode, it disintegrated. 6 tons of high-grade steel and sensitive electronics were transformed into a cloud of jagged shrapnel that shredded the surrounding support vehicles. The volatile liquid fuel inside the Shahab-3 missile ignited instantly, creating a secondary fireball that rose 300 feet into the air, a column of roiling orange and black that smelled of chemical fire and scorched earth. The Iranian defenders reacted with a mixture of panic and desperate discipline. Soldiers near the impact site were thrown like ragdolls by the overpressure, their uniforms scorched by the sudden, intense heat. Those further away scrambled toward their light anti-aircraft guns, but the response was fragmented and chaotic. One crew managed to fire a burst of 23mm cannon fire into the dark sky, the red tracers arcing uselessly into the smoke. In the command bunker, officers screamed into radios that were now producing only static, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the burning launchers on their external monitors. The valley was no longer a military installation. It was a geography of fire. Black, oily smoke boiled out of the craters where the launchers had stood just seconds before. The primary launch site was a graveyard of twisted metal and secondary explosions as the remaining missiles on their rails began to cook off, sending streaks of unguided propellant screaming into the hillsides. Seconds later, the second and third waves of Tomahawks arrived. They did not target the burning wreckage, but sought out the remaining launchers on the periphery. One missile slammed into a hardened ammunition bunker, the impact triggering a massive sympathetic detonation that tore the roof off the structure and sent a shockwave through the valley floor that was recorded on seismographs as far away as Dubai. The heat in the center of the base reached 2,000 degrees, melting the asphalt of the staging areas and turning the limestone dust into a fine, glowing ash. On the USS Gerald R. Ford, the impact-confirmed signals began to flood the tactical net. The strike group's battle damage assessment team, using real-time feeds from a Global Hawk drone loitering at 60,000 feet, watched as the red icons representing the Iranian launchers vanished one by one. The admiral watched the screen in silence. The Bandar Abbas strike had achieved total tactical surprise. The first phase of the operation was a complete success, but the mission was far from over. To the west, the command bunkers at Bushehr were the next targets on the list, and the Tomahawks assigned to those coordinates were already beginning their terminal dives. The air over the Persian Gulf remained still, but the horizon to the north was now glowing with the unnatural light of a dozen massive fires. The first climax of the morning had been delivered with the clinical, devastating precision of the United States Navy. 5:12 in the morning. The coastal mountains 40 miles inland from the port of Bushehr. The primary target was not visible from the surface. Buried beneath 30 meters of reinforced concrete and granite overburden, the Foreign Strategic Command Center and its associated hardened silos were the crown jewels of their ballistic missile program. These facilities, located at coordinates 28 degrees 59 minutes north, 58 degrees 50 minutes east, were designed to survive a conventional air campaign. The air in the surrounding valleys was thin and cold, smelling of dry pine and the metallic scent of old stone. Inside the bunkers, the environment was sterile and pressurized, filled with the low-frequency hum of air filtration systems and the rhythmic clicking of servers. The second wave of the military strike was specifically tailored for these hard and deeply buried targets. While the first wave at Bandar Abbas had utilized standard high-explosive warheads to shred mobile launchers, the missiles, now approaching Bushehr, were equipped with the Joint Multi-Effects Warhead System. These were tandem-charge penetrators, designed to function like a high-speed drill made of fire and kinetic energy. 20 cruise missiles, having navigated the treacherous canyons of the foreign mountains, began their final approach. They did not dive in a random pattern. The strike group's mission planners had assigned pairs of missiles to each silo cap, programmed to hit the exact same impact point with a timing difference of less than 3 seconds. This was a masterclass in synchronized ballistics. The first missile of the lead pair entered its terminal maneuver 3 miles from the target. It climbed sharply, its turbofan engine screaming at maximum thrust, before rolling inverted and pitching into a near-vertical 90-degree dive. The precursor charge on the nose of the cruise missile ignited 5 meters above the ground. A jet of molten copper, traveling at 8,000 meters per second, punched through the 3-meter-thick concrete silo cover, creating a stabilized hole for the main body of the missile. A millisecond later, the 1,000-pound hardened steel penetrator followed, the jet, driving deep into the vertical shaft. The impact was not a singular bang, but a sequence of grinding, high-velocity collisions that sent a shockwave through the mountain. Inside the command bunker, the world suddenly came apart. The lights flickered and died as the primary power lines were severed by the first impact. The floor heaved upward with a violent, sickening lurch that threw armed officers against the consoles. The sound was a deafening, metallic shriek, the sound of the silo's internal structure being crushed by the kinetic force of the military weapon. Dust and pulverized concrete filled the air in a gray, choking fog. Before the defenders could even grasp the scale of the intrusion, the main warhead detonated 30 meters underground. The explosion was contained within the narrow confines of the silo, magnifying the pressure to impossible levels. A massive column of white-hot flame and pulverized debris erupted from the silo entrance, shooting 500 feet into the morning sky like a volcanic vent. The secondary explosions of the foreign missiles stored within the silos added to the carnage as liquid fuel tanks ruptured and ignited in a chain reaction. The ground shook with a sustained, low-frequency roar that could be felt in the soles of the armed personnel's boots on the naval warship, 50 miles away. The reaction from the foreign staff remaining in the lower levels was one of total, paralyzed shock. Emergency alarms wailed in the darkness, but there was no one left to answer them. The command and control links to the rest of the country were severed in a single, surgical stroke. The immediate aftermath was a haunting silence in the valley, broken only by the crackle of burning electronics and the sound of settling rubble. A massive, black plume of smoke began to drift toward the Gulf, marking the site where the heart of the regional missile threat had just been extinguished. On the bridge of the naval cruiser, the sensor operators watched the thermal signatures on their displays. The silo neutralized notifications were appearing in rapid succession. The admiral on the aircraft carrier received the report at 5:15 in the morning. The hardened facilities, once thought to be impregnable, had been neutralized with 98% efficiency. The military forces had successfully demonstrated that there was no bunker deep enough to hide from a coordinated cruise missile strike. The sun was now just beginning to touch the highest peaks of the mountains, illuminating the columns of smoke that rose like black pillars across the foreign landscape. The physical combat phase of the morning was reaching its peak, and the electronic battlefield was about to become the next theater of absolute dominance. 5:18 in the morning. The airspace 40 miles off the Iranian coast, north of the Strait of Hormuz. The 4 EA-18 Gulf Growler electronic warfare aircraft, launched from the USS Gerald R held their stations in a high-altitude racetrack orbit. The air at 30,000 feet was a cold, thin vacuum, smelling of recycled oxygen, and the faint, ozone-like scent of high-powered electronics working at their thermal limits. Inside the cockpits, the electronic warfare officers were not looking through the glass at the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. Instead, they were submerged in a digital world of waveforms, pulse repetition frequencies, and infrared signatures. The Growler's AN/ALQ-99 jamming pods were screaming on every frequency used by the Iranian HQ-9 and SA-6 surface-to-air missile batteries. The electronic noise was so intense that the Iranian radar screens did not just show snow. They were physically overloaded by the sheer volume of false targets and digital ghosting generated by the American jets. The technical superiority of the United States Navy was being projected through the electromagnetic spectrum with the same force as the Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Iranian air defense network, which had cost billions of dollars and decades of effort to build, was being reduced to a collection of blind, screaming sensors that could no longer communicate with one another. Suddenly, a single HQ-9 battery near the port of Bandar Abbas attempted to break through the interference by shifting to a backup optical tracking system and a high-power burst of its engagement radar. The battery commander, desperate to defend the burning ruins of the missile sites, authorized a manual launch of 4 interceptor missiles into the gray morning light. The 4 interceptors tore off their launch rails with a shriek, leaving 4 vertical pillars of white smoke that rose into the cold air. They were blind, searching for a target that the Growlers had already erased from the sky. The lead Growler pilot saw the thermal bloom of the launches on his infrared display and banked his aircraft hard to the left, his hands steady on the stick. As the G-forces pressed him into his seat, he did not need to evade. He needed to strike back and finish the suppression of the enemy's air defense. He toggled the weapon select switch on his stick to the AGM-88 HARM, the high-speed anti-radiation missile designed specifically for this moment. The trigger was squeezed. The AGM-88 HARM missile shrieked off the underwing station, a white column of fire punching backward through the thin air at 30,000 feet. The heat blast from the launch washed across the wing of the Growler, leaving a momentary streak of orange light on the cockpit glass and filling the pilot's ears with a percussive roar. The missile accelerated to Mach 2 in less than 3 seconds, its seeker head locked onto the specific radar frequency of the Iranian battery. It was a weapon that fed on the enemy's own attempts to see. The warhead, containing thousands of tungsten cubes, punched through the radar van's cooling system and detonated exactly 3 meters above the primary dish. The radar array erupted instantly, the dish being shredded into 1,000 pieces of twisted metal that were sent flying across the launch site like lethal shrapnel. The secondary explosion of the remaining interceptor missiles on the ground turned the battery into a localized sun, a fireball that bleached the surrounding dunes white and sent a shockwave through the sand that could be seen from the air. The remaining Iranian air defense units, seeing the catastrophic fate of their comrades, went into a state of total electronic silence. They shut down their radars and retreated into their bunkers, leaving the sky over the province of Hormozgan wide open. The path for the final waves of the Tomahawk salvo was now a clear corridor of unopposed movement. The smoke from the destroyed radar site rose in a thin, black line against the rising sun, a signal of the total collapse of the Iranian defensive grid. 5:22 in the morning. The electronic battlefield had been won with the same surgical efficiency as the physical strike. On the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Admiral watched. The radar status board turned from a cluttered mess of enemy threats to a clean, empty expanse of blue. The electronic chaoses had done its job, and the strike group was now moving into the final phases of the engagement, preparing for the assessment of a landscape that had been fundamentally altered in less than 40 minutes. 5:25 in the morning. The hangar deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. While the fires from the Tomahawk impacts were still visible as orange flickers on the northern horizon, the internal machinery of Carrier Strike Group 12 was already resetting for the next phase of the operation. The hangar bay was a cavernous space of 333 meters, illuminated by the harsh, white glare of industrial lights. The environment was a high-intensity choreography of steel and sweat, smelling of lithium grease, JP-5 jet fuel, and the humid heat generated by 5,000 sailors working at the peak of their professional capacity. Every movement was disciplined, every action was governed by a manual of procedures that had been refined over 80 years of naval history. On the flight deck above, the 4 EA-18 Gulf Growler electronic warfare aircraft were beginning their recovery cycle. As each aircraft caught the arresting wire and was taxied to its parking spot, a team of 20 yellow shirt and purple shirt sailors swarmed the airframe. The logistics of a modern strike required an immediate pit stop mentality. Within 90 seconds of engine shutdown, heavy fuel hoses were connected to the fuselage, pumping thousands of gallons of high-grade kerosene into the internal tanks. Technicians in grease-stained jerseys began the process of inspecting the ANALQ-99 jamming pods, checking for thermal damage caused by the intense electronic output of the morning's engagement. Deep within the hull of the destroyer, DDG-87, USS Mason, the inventory of the Mark 41 vertical launch system was being updated in real time. The ship had expended a significant portion of its primary offensive ordnance in less than 10 minutes. The fire controlman worked in the quiet, climate-controlled environment of the magazine spaces, verifying the status of the remaining 64 cells. They were not just counting missiles, they were calculating the strategic weight of the ship's remaining defensive capabilities. Each cell that was now empty represented a gap in the fleet's shield that would eventually need to be refilled by a dedicated ammunition ship. The logistics of fire extended far beyond the combatants themselves. 40 miles to the south, the supply ship USNS Arctic was already maneuvering to a rendezvous point. This massive vessel, carrying over 170,000 barrels of fuel and 2,100 tons of dry stores, was the lifeblood of the strike group. The commanding officer of the Gerald R. Ford was already reviewing the requirements for an underway replenishment, a complex maneuver, where two ships of over 100,000 tons would move in parallel, only 45 meters apart, while transferring fuel and ammunition across high-tension wires. This was the silent, dangerous work that allowed the United States Navy to remain on station for months at a time. In the medical bay of the carrier, the atmosphere was one of quiet, preventative preparation. While no American casualties had been reported, in the opening strike, the medical teams were at modified triage status. They had prepared 40 beds for immediate surgical intervention and had stabilized 200 units of whole blood. The surgical nurses checked the inventory of sterile dressings and trauma kits, their faces calm but focused. In a superpower conflict, the logistics of human repair were just as critical as the logistics of weapon replenishment. They were ready for the what-if scenarios that followed every major offensive action. The engineering departments on all ships were operating at 105% of rated capacity. The nuclear reactors on the USS Gerald R. Ford were generating the massive amounts of electrical power required to run the electromagnetic aircraft launch system and the complex radar arrays of the strike group. The temperature in the lower machinery spaces hovered at 42 degrees Celsius, a dry, metallic heat that tasted of steam and oil. The mechanics performed round-the-clock vibration analysis on the main drive shafts, ensuring that the fleet could accelerate to 30 knots at a moment's notice if an Iranian counterstrike was detected. Behind the scenes, the data logistics were equally intense. The strike group's communications officers were managing a flow of information that exceeded 10 gigabits per second. They were transmitting the battle damage assessment data to the Pentagon and receiving updated target lists for the next 24 hours. This was the digital supply chain that linked a sailor on a console in the Persian Gulf to a 4-star general in Washington. The precision of the morning strike was a direct result of this invisible, relentless movement of data. By 5:45 in the morning, the first cycle of rearming and refueling was nearly complete. The strike group was a self-sustaining ecosystem of violence and restoration. The professional sailors of the United States Navy understood that battles were won by the missiles, but wars were won by the people who ensured the missiles were always ready to fly. The deck was clean, the hoses were being coiled, and the next wave of aircraft was already being moved toward the catapults. The machinery of the Fifth Fleet was ready for whatever the dawn would bring. 6:15 in the morning. The stratosphere above the Hormuzgan province, the RQ-4 Global Hawk drone, a silent sentinel with a wingspan of nearly 40 meters, banked slowly at an altitude of 18,000 meters. Its synthetic aperture radar and high-resolution infrared cameras were currently slicing through the thick black smoke that still rose from the Bandar Abbas missile base. The air at this altitude was minus 50 degrees Celsius, a dead, thin void that smelled of nothing but the recycled ozone of the drone's internal avionics. Below, the world was a map of fire and ruined ambitions, and the drone was the primary witness to the efficiency of the military forces' strike. The data gathered by the RQ-4 was transmitted in a continuous, encrypted stream to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the Flag Command Center on the aircraft carrier. On the carrier, the battle damage assessment team sat in a darkened room, their eyes moving across high-definition monitors that displayed the before and after imagery of the target zones. The resolution was so high that they could count the individual charred tires of the destroyed mobile launchers. Each analyst was a specialist in structural engineering or ballistics, and their job was to confirm that the strategic objectives of the mission had been met. The report for the coastal military base sector was the first to be finalized. Of the 24 mobile transporter erector launchers identified before the strike, 24 were confirmed as catastrophic kills. The imagery showed the scorched skeletons of the heavy trucks, their hydraulic arms twisted into unnatural shapes by the heat of the cruise missile impacts. The secondary explosions of the foreign ballistic missile liquid fuel tanks had created craters that were 15 meters wide and 6 meters deep. The assessment team categorized the site as combat ineffective for a minimum of 12 months. At the underground missile facility, the results were equally decisive. The infrared sensors detected the cooling thermal signatures of the deep penetration strikes. 12 hardened vertical launch tubes were categorized as non-functional. Their heavy concrete caps either shattered or fused shut by the heat of the tandem warhead detonations. The underground command and control bunker showed no signs of life or electronic activity. The analysts noted that the internal pressure wave from the cruise missile strikes had likely collapsed the primary ventilation and communication shafts, sealing the facility from the inside. Total neutralization of the primary ballistic threat, the lead analyst reported to the senior military commander at 6:45 in the morning. The foreign military forces has lost approximately 85% of its regional strike capacity in the last 90 minutes. The casualty assessment was conducted with the same clinical detachment. Based on the number of personnel seen on the satellite imagery during the fueling phase, the estimated enemy casualties were listed as 340 personnel killed or seriously wounded. On the American side, the report was a testament to the lopsided nature of modern standoff warfare. The military forces reported 0 personnel lost, 0 aircraft damaged, and 0 ships hit. The only cost to the strike group was the inventory of 120 cruise missiles and 4 AGM-88 HARM missiles. Despite the tactical success, the atmosphere in the Flag Command Center remained professional and muted. There was no cheering. The senior military commander knew that the destruction of the missile sites was only the first chapter of a larger geopolitical shift. He looked at the final tally on his screen: 24 launchers, 12 silos, 3 radar sites, and 1 command center obliterated. The precision of the strike had achieved the objective while minimizing collateral damage to the nearby civilian port facilities, a key requirement of the presidential order. The Global Hawk drone continued its orbit, its sensors now searching for any signs of a secondary foreign response. It watched the coastal roads for the movement of reinforcements and monitored the airfields for any attempt to launch a retaliatory airstrike. But the imagery showed only chaos and retreat. The foreign military was in a state of total defensive reorganization. Their communications shattered and their primary offensive teeth pulled. By 7 in the morning, the battle damage assessment was uploaded to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. The digital after-action report contained hundreds of high-resolution images, thermal maps, and coordinate verifications. It was the final proof that the military forces had executed a preemptive strike with a level of technical perfection that redefined the boundaries of regional power projection. The long reach of the carrier strike group had reached out and rewritten the map of the regional Gulf in a single morning. 7:15 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz and the waters of the northern Arabian Sea. The strategic landscape of the Middle East had been fundamentally altered in less than 3 hours. The smoke from the Bandar Abbas and Bushehr strikes was now visible on meteorological satellites as a series of distinct, black plumes drifting southeast across the Gulf of Oman. As the data from the Global Hawk drones reached the Pentagon and the National Security Council, the geopolitical fallout began to ripple through the world's capitals. This was the strategic shift, the moment where the Iranian ability to hold the global energy supply hostage was systematically dismantled by the precision of the United States Navy. Since the start of the conflict in late February 2026, the Strait of Hormuz had been functionally closed to international shipping. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had used the threat of their ballistic missile inventory and coastal batteries to drive insurance rates to impossible levels, effectively blockading the 20% of the world's oil that passed through the narrow waterway. But as the sun rose over the burning ruins of the Imam Ali base, that blockade was no longer a viable military reality. The teeth of the Iranian position, the mobile launchers and hardened silos had been pulled. In the Flag Command Center of the USS Gerald R. the transition from kinetic strike to maritime security was immediate. Admiral Thorne issued the command for the Hormuz Transit Protocol to be activated. This was the second phase of Operation Epic Fury. The United States Navy was not just destroying targets, it was asserting total, unopposed dominance over the world's most critical maritime choke point. The cruiser, CG-73 USS Port Royal, and the destroyer, DDG-87 USS Mason, were ordered to take up escort positions at the western entrance of the strait, their radar arrays scanning for any remaining Iranian fast attack craft that might attempt a desperate suicide mission. The global economic reaction was instantaneous. As the first reports of the successful strike hit the financial news wires, the price of Brent crude oil, which had spiked to $120 per barrel during the crisis, began a sharp and sustained decline. In the boardrooms of Tokyo, Seoul, and Shanghai, the energy panic of March 2026 began to subside. The message from the United States was clear. The artery of global commerce was being reopened by force of arms. The de facto blockade that had crippled international markets for 3 weeks was now being dissolved by the presence of a single, determined carrier strike group. For the regional allies of the United States, the strike was a moment of profound strategic relief. In Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Tel Aviv, military commanders observed the total collapse of the Iranian missile threat with a mixture of professional respect and strategic calculation. The saturation doctrine, that Iran had spent 20 years developing the idea that they could overwhelm regional defenses with sheer numbers, had been defeated by a preemptive American strike that was faster, more accurate, and more lethal than any countermeasure the Revolutionary Guard could deploy. The Iranian leadership, meanwhile, was in a state of unprecedented internal crisis. With their primary offensive capability destroyed and their command and control nodes silenced, the regime's ability to project power beyond its borders had evaporated. The strategic shift meant that Iran was no longer a regional hegemon capable of dictating terms to its neighbors. They were now a besieged power, focused entirely on internal survival and the defense of their remaining conventional assets. The death of key leadership figures in the earlier phases of the war had already created a vacuum, and the loss of the missile program was the final blow to their prestige. By 7:45 in the morning, the first commercial tankers, which had been anchored off the coast of Fujairah for weeks, began to weigh anchor. They were moving under the protective umbrella of the Fifth Fleet. The United States Navy had transitioned from a strike force to a global police force in a matter of minutes. The air over the strait was now filled with the sound of MH-60 Sierra helicopters, their door gunners watching the water for mines or small craft, while the carrier's fighters provided a constant CAP, or combat air patrol, overhead. The USS Gerald R. Ford remained the center of this new reality. The world's largest warship was a floating statement of American resolve. The admiral knew that while the physical fires would eventually go out, the strategic fires lit by this morning's salvo would burn for decades. The United States had not just won a battle, it had re-established the rules of the international maritime order. The Strait of Hormuz was open, the threat was neutralized, and the professional sailors of Strike Group 12 had ensured that the strategic shift was leaning decisively in favor of the West. 8 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 60 miles southwest of the Iranian coast. The sun was now fully above the horizon, casting a long, golden light across the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The air was crisp, the humidity of the night replaced by a dry, desert breeze that carried the faint, lingering smell of salt and the distant, cooling iron of the fleet. From the vantage point of the carrier's bridge, the sea looked like a sheet of blue glass, broken only by the white wakes of the escorting destroyers and the rhythmic movement of the carrier's own massive hull. The violence of the early morning felt like a distant memory, yet the columns of black smoke on the northern horizon remained as a physical testament to the power that had been unleashed. In the Flag Command Center, Admiral Thorne sat at the head of the conference table for the final mission debrief. The mission accomplished report was being prepared for transmission to the Secretary of Defense. The tone of the room was one of professional exhaustion and quiet pride. There were no celebrations, only the systematic closing of tactical files and the transition to a long-term maritime security posture. The United States Navy had executed one of the most complex and successful preemptive strikes in its history, and the results were now being quantified with cold, mathematical precision. The cost of the operation, while significant, was measured against the catastrophic price of a regional war that had been successfully averted. The strike group had expended exactly 120 Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missiles. At an estimated cost of $2 million per unit, the ordnance expenditure alone totaled $240 million. When the costs of aviation fuel for the EA-18 Gulf Growler sorties, the wear and tear on the nuclear propulsion systems, and the logistics of the supply chain were added, the total bill for the morning's work reached nearly $300 million. However, the cost to the United States in human lives was recorded as a miraculous zero. Not a single sailor, pilot, or technician in Carrier Strike Group 12 had been killed or injured during the engagement. The technical superiority of the standoff weapons and the absolute dominance of the electronic warfare spectrum had created a zero-risk environment for the American forces. On the Iranian side, the human cost was heavy, but restricted entirely to the military personnel operating the missile sites. The final assessment estimated 380 enemy personnel killed in action, all of whom were active members of the Revolutionary Guard's strategic missile units. There were no reports of civilian casualties in the nearby city of Bandar Abbas, a result of the pinpoint accuracy of the GPS and digital scene matching guidance systems. The restoration of regional stability was the most valuable outcome of the mission. By 8:30 in the morning, the maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz had reached its highest volume in 6 weeks. 10 massive oil tankers, carrying millions of barrels of crude for markets in Europe and Asia, were now transiting the narrow waterway under the protective shadow of the USS Mason. The blockade was broken. The energy ransom that had threatened the global economy was over. The United States had re-established its role as the ultimate guarantor of the freedom of navigation, proving that no regional actor could unilaterally close the world's most vital maritime choke point without facing immediate and total neutralization. Strategic analysts at Central Command noted that the strike had achieved a decade-long deterrence. By erasing the Iranian ballistic missile inventory in a single morning, the United States had sent a message that resonated far beyond the Persian Gulf. Any nation contemplating the use of mobile missile technology to threaten American interests now had a bend-to-assist, clear, high-definition record of the consequences. The Iranian missile program, once the cornerstone of the regime's regional influence, scorched craters and twisted scrap metal. The balance of power in the Middle East had shifted back toward a stable, predictable equilibrium. As the USS Gerald R turned into the wind for a final recovery of its patrol aircraft, the admiral looked out at the horizon one last time. The 26th of March, 2026, would be remembered as the day the United States Navy proved that its long reach was not just a slogan, but a physical reality. The strike group would remain on station for another 90 days, ensuring that the peace they had won with fire was maintained by their presence. The machinery of the fleet continued its rhythmic, tireless work, ready to project power at a moment's notice, while the world moved forward into a morning that was finally and decisively quiet. The mission was a success. The targets were gone. The sea was open,